And welcome back on Take Action News with David Shuster. This is executive producer Daniel Marins, and I'm going to be taking us through the rest of this second hour here on Take Action News Saturday, April 20th. There was extraordinary news in the world of economics and, in fact, policy this week when a much-touted paper, the so-called Reinhart Rogoff paper called Growth in a Time of Debt, it dates from 2010 from the Harvard professors Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff. It has been used as justification for many of the austerity policies in Europe and those who advocate it here in the United States, essentially saying that once debt, a nation's debt, becomes 90% of its GDP, 90% of its economy, then that amount of debt begins to create slower growth, slower economic growth. That is the tipping point. They found in their study of many, many countries that these countries with 90% debt to GDP ratios averaged minus 0.1% GDP growth. Now, at the time, there were many experts that were already poo-pooing this study for a number of different reasons, including economists like Paul Krugman and Dean Baker, and in fact, many others, who essentially said, this is a case of correlation and not causation. You can't take a look at these countries and say, well, they have 90% debt to GDP and happen to, over the course of a certain number of years, have sluggish growth, and then say that it's the fault of the debt. Because in fact, what you could really be looking at is that it's a reverse. That countries that have slow growth have higher debt to GDP ratios. And of course, the most famous example of this is the case of Japan in the 1990s, where the economy collapsed and subsequently their debt to GDP ratios skyrocketed. Now, of course, that in itself is also not a major concern because Japan, in fact, still maintains debt to GDP ratios that are on the orders of even larger than their entire economy, and yet they pay normal interest rates. The bond markets haven't panicked. So that's another myth that goes into the idea of a bond market panic. So to begin with, the conclusions were suspect. And yet, across the world, Reinhart Rogoff, R&R, became synonymous with smart economics, austerity economics, the way the European Union was imposing cuts and higher interest rates for their member countries, and the way many right-wing and, in fact, centrist beltway policy establishment types in Washington were advocating for major cuts in our social insurance programs, major changes to the way we do things in this country, was on the basis of this paper, of this one very paper, or at least on the supposed basis of that paper. Well, it turns out that even if the Reinhart Rogoff methodology was off and the conclusions that they draw are off, it turns out even more basic things are off, because the thing about this study was that it could never be replicated, or it had not been replicated, or people were not clear about how it could be replicated. But finally, a group of economists at University of Massachusetts Amherst did replicate the study to the extent it is possible. They are known by an acronym known as HAP, Thomas Herndon, Michael Ash, and Robert Pollan, and they found that there are just simply tremendous and elementary flaws in the study, to the point of even Microsoft Excel errors, the kind of stuff that you and I would get fired for making at a workplace on behalf of our boss.